So I feel like I have a lot to cover, so I want to start really punctually. Can I start now, Ed? Okay, so this, oh, perfect. It just turned 10:05 according to the laptop I have up here. All right, native app awesomeness without the native app. So this is going to be about a few different things, but a large part of the focus is going to be on mobile web performance optimization. So if anybody came here thinking that this was going to be about, you know, Apache Cordova and PhoneGap or something, I apologize. We can talk about that some other time if you'd like. So this is me. There's nothing specific about MWF in this talk. It applies to pretty much any mobile website. I'll try to stop saying let's work on that. This applies to nearly any mobile website. This is me. This is where I work. That's me on Twitter. Maybe we'll have time for questions at the end. If we don't, you know, feel free to hit me up on Twitter. Follow me on Twitter. It makes me feel more important than I actually am. And that's trot.github.com. You'll find a few projects I'm working on, but also you'll find these slides. So if you don't feel like taking notes, but you see something you want to note, that's where you can get it. So this is a graph that's going to take some explanation. So this would typically be displayed as a histogram, but it was just too packed with junk when I tried to display as a histogram. So the y-axis represents, so actually let me explain how I got the numbers first, and I'll explain how I graph them. So Dave Olson at West Virginia University, who I see some people nodding, that's good, you know who he is. He maintains, among other things, he has this a directory of mobile EDU websites. So I screen scraped his entire directory and wrote a node script to use Patrick Meenan's webpagetest.org to run all of those sites over and over and over again through an iPhone connected via Wi-Fi in Dulles, Virginia, to record performance metrics about the sites. So this is load time, first load time, so an empty cache, nothing cached, not reloading. Load time is on the x-axis. The y-axis is the number of sites that fell into that category. So you can see that there's like a small number of sites that load in less than 1 second, and then over 90 sites that loaded in between 1 and 2 seconds, and again over 90 sites that loaded between 2 and 3 seconds, and then it falls off precipitously. And way down there is a site that took 37 seconds to load. So you might be looking at these numbers and thinking, yeah, these actually look pretty good. We don't really have a problem in the EDU space. And these numbers actually do look pretty good. A big reason why these numbers look good is because a lot of the sites close to me, the sites that load really fast, have virtually no content. It's like, you know, a list of 6 or 7 text links that then go to other sites. So I might show one later on, but let's so here's what the numbers look like. And I highlighted the median because that's the most important thing, right? The mean can be skewed by that 37-second site way out on the tail. But the median will be the typical site. So we can see that a typical EDU mobile website loads in about 2.5 seconds, which, you know, and oh, incidentally, real quick, this is what the fastest loading one looks like. So, you know, like I said, like a lot of the super fast loading sites, you know, don't really have a lot of gloss to them. Now, if this meets your needs, awesome. I'm going to guess, though, that if you came to this talk, this is probably not the type of site you're looking to create. But, you know, again, you know, apparently for West Virginia University libraries, this is what they need, and there's absolutely, positively nothing wrong with that. Okay, so I also went to mobile.httparchive.org. This is something that Steve Souders has set up, I believe, where they also record statistics like the ones I took for the mobile EDU space, but they record them for it's a combination of the Alexa top 10,000 or whatever and a bunch of other sites. And this isn't, you know, as I wrote at the top, this is an apples and oranges comparison, because a lot of these, in fact, most of these sites that are listed as top sites, they're not mobile sites. They're not even mobile optimized, but this is how long they take to load on a mobile site. The fastest one, by the way, is megaupload.com. So, you know, if you want to see what a super fast commercial site looks like loading a mobile phone, you can go to www.megaupload.com. Anyway, the median for the top sites at mobile.htparchive.org is 5 seconds. So again, you know, apples and oranges comparison, it's a little unfair, but still, you know, mobile EDU sites are actually kind of doing okay performance-wise. But we can always do better. And again, you know, the more stuff you want to do with your site, the more performance becomes a problem, and you end up taking 37 seconds to load. So someone once said something along the lines of optimize what is most important, not what is most interesting. So we all know that guy or gal who, you know, will spend 3 hours tweaking a JavaScript file, then recompiling it with UE compressor or closure compiler or whatever, trying to squeeze out that last 10 bytes that they think they can get out of that file. So who knows that person? Really? Who is that person? All right, you're all lying. All right, good. Well, the point is that, you know, with web performance optimization, you can often go down a rabbit hole. And the way to avoid going down the rabbit hole of spending lots of time on things that don't matter is to not do faith-based optimizations. So what people often tend to do is they run their site through YSlow, or they run their site through page speed, and that's great, that's awesome. And then they just try to do whatever whatever it says to do, without like taking measurements that it's, you know, to make sure that they're actually addressing something that actually matters. Because the truth of the matter is that if you have a reasonably complex site or reasonably rich site, the only way you're not going to get a 100 score on page speed or on YSlow. The only sites that get that are empty pages, or, you know, pages with nothing but text. And so you really want to make sure that you're devoting your scant precious web optimization resources towards things that matter. And so in that regard, I really recommend webpagetest.org, and I really recommend using the site speed stuff in Google Analytics, which I'll talk a little bit about more later. Both of those things have limitations, but you know, they're getting better all the time and all that sort of stuff. So they're worth knowing about, they're worth using. Okay, so I wish I had recorded the stats, because I did the measurements and everything, and then, you know, when I optimized m.ucsf.edu, I wish I'd recorded, because I would love to just put a little graph that says, here's how long it took to load, and then I did this, and here's how long it took to load, and then I did this, and, you know. But unfortunately, I wasn't thinking in presentation mode. I was thinking in, okay, I got the information I need, I'm now going to throw that in the recycle bin mode. So you're just going to have to take my word for it that these are the things that mattered. Now, this was for my site and my situation. Your mileage may vary, so, you know, we'll talk about that a little later as well. HTTP compression. It blows my mind how many sites out there do not serve up their content over HTTP with compression and just serve it as plain text. Especially if your site has a lot of text, that's going to make a really, really big difference. And it definitely made a big difference in my case, because I don't have a single page app where all the content is loaded on the first page load, but I definitely have more than the first page loaded. I have a lot of other stuff to help, you know, to make navigation fast, and it really helps to compress that stuff. It's amazing that people go through the agony of spriting images, and they go through the agony of, you know, I guess there are tools now that make it less agonizing, but of minifying their JavaScript and their CSS and their HTML, but they don't serve it. You know, if you can just not do all that stuff and turn on mod deflate for those resources, and you'll get better results. And I do not know why this isn't a default in Apache. I'm sure there's a good reason, but definitely look into that if you're not doing that. Okay, optimizing images. This is another thing. You'll often get from your designer, you know, a PNG file that is, you know, small because it's for a mobile site, but it's really, really detailed or something, and, you know, very, very rich color palette that just isn't gonna isn't necessary. So I use ImageOptim, which is a tool on the Mac that allows you to drag a directory of images, drag and drop, and then it optimizes them in place. That's really fantastic. But there's a million other tools. There's PNG NQ, PNG Crush. There's JPEG equivalents. If you have never tried doing that with your images, you might want to see how big they are, optimize them, see how big they are after you optimize them, and then open them up and see if you can tell the difference between which one's optimized and which one isn't. That was the other thing I did, was I brought in a few coworkers and I said, okay, which image looks better? And nobody could tell the difference, so I was very happy with that. Okay. Let's see here. Right, eliminate redirects. This one I did take measurements on. Well, I took measurements on this, but this one I did save the measurements, which is that the library site for the library's mobile site for UCSF loaded over 2 seconds faster without a redirect. Of course, that depends a lot on the network. Are you on 3G? Are you on Wi-Fi? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But redirects really hurt first page load performance, and it's one of the things that makes you your site's loading. Oops, now it's reloading, and I just want to take the phone and throw it against the wall and go get a drink. So, okay, eliminate redirects. Preloading large CSS images. So I noticed in the waterfall for UCSF Mobile, what was happening is it downloaded all the HTML. And then it had to parse it, and it said, oh, there's this CSS file. Download the CSS file, parsed it, continued parsing the DOM, and then it figured out that, oh, because this rule applies over here, I now need to download these 2 images because we have a watermark on the left side and we have sort of this gradient background thing. And it had to download these 2 images, and that only started happening after 500 milliseconds because it had to do all that other stuff. Well, half a second is a lot to shave off a page load. So by inserting some trickery like this in the top of the HTML file, it triggered the download immediately. And normally, of course, you want to defer downloads until the last minute when there are things that aren't going to affect the interface, the display. This obviously affects the interface and the display, so you want that download to start happening as soon as possible. Okay, removing unused JS code. MWF uses Modernizer, so does everybody else on the planet. Modernizer's awesome. This comment is not solely about Modernizer, but this is what it was for me, was you download the default Modernizer, and it's got tons of stuff in it, all these tests and rules, and all that JavaScript has to be downloaded, it has to be parsed, and in the case of Modernizer, it inserts classes into the body tag, I believe. It might be the HTML tag, but I think it's the body tag. And these classes require Modernizer. Does everyone know what Modernizer is? Okay, good. These classes require Modernizer to run tests. So it's not only just downloading and parsing, it actually has to run this stuff where, like, okay, now I'm going to create a local storage item and I'm going to try removing it, and okay, good, this device doesn't just think it has local storage, it really does. I'm going to put that in the body tag. So you can have JSS, you can have CSS rules about, if this thing supports local storage, display this button or whatever, I guess. So it has a whole bunch of those things. So I was only using Modernizer for 2 things. I was using it to detect local storage, and I was using it for something else that I can't even remember what it was. That's how significant it is. So you can go to modernizer.com, I think, and they have this nice little, build tool. You don't have to know anything about compiling, about JavaScript, whatever. You just need to know what tests in Modernizer what are you actually using Modernizer for? Uncheck all the boxes, check the boxes you need, say, give me this Modernizer, and you get one that could be 1/10 the size of the one that you download otherwise, or 1/5 anyway, and also just that just doesn't run a whole bunch of tests up front that you're not using. Because I suspect that most people who use Modernizer are not even really using those classes that get inserted into the DOM. Anyway, so but the broader picture is, man, if you can get rid of JavaScript code that you're not using, it's totally worth it. At least it was for me. Okay, this is a weird one. So deferring JavaScript is a common performance thing to do, but this is a weird way to do it. At least I think it's weird. But I'm not the person who came up with this technique, although I came up with this specific 4 lines of code, but it was based on work by other people. I initially came across it from Ryan Fioravanti, I think his name is, who's a guy at Google. His technique, though, initially at least only worked in Chrome, and I needed to work in Firefox and other things. Anyway, this works in everything I've tested. So, deferring JavaScript. So you want to look up the rules for deferring JavaScript. You can't use document write and so on and so forth. There's a few things you need to make sure you do. Basically, you can only defer you don't want to defer JavaScript if the JavaScript is going to affect your layout. But if it's something that just runs in the that can run after everything's rendered, then you don't want to use the mobile phone's limited resources to download JavaScript, parse the JavaScript, execute the JavaScript when all of those resources could be used to download, say, HTML and CSS and images and render those. So the obvious question that comes up with, so this improved my page load time by 15%, which shocked me. I thought for sure this wasn't going to work. And I sure as heck didn't think that it was going to be, this is, by the way, is why no faith-based optimizations, do them and measure. I also thought for sure that if I just take the script tag and stick it at the bottom, which is a really common way to deal with the problem of, that'll work just as well. Or if I just say script defer or script async and leave it in the head, that'll defer the JavaScript. But the key thing that this does that those techniques don't, and I'm not the person who figured this out, I don't think, but is that it doesn't delay the load event. And I had a whole bunch of things, I still have a whole bunch of things that happen on load that have to happen for the rendering to feel complete. And so if you do say script defer, or if you put your script tag at the bottom, it's going to start downloading the JavaScript, and the load event's not going to fire until it's done. If you do this waits for the load event, and then inserts the JavaScript into the DOM, and that's when. So it's already because the script tag isn't even in there until the load event fires. Load event is not delayed. So that's the secret sauce that happens there. If you don't want to do this yourself, if you prefer libraries that do this, Steve Souders has a library called Control.js that basically does the same thing. I preferred just shoving in 4 lines of JavaScript into my HTML, which gives some people hives. I don't mind it. Okay, so, oh, by the way, and then there's another technique for doing this as well, although it doesn't delay the download of the JavaScript, but it's kind of interesting, and Google Mail does this, which is that it downloads the JavaScript inline, because sometimes for performance reasons it makes sense to inline everything, so that's another thing to try and measure. So they inline the JavaScript in the HTML, but it's commented out, and the idea is that most people aren't going to need to run this JavaScript, so we don't want to spend resources parsing it, because even if you don't run it, you have to parse it, and that can be significant. So then what they do is when they need it, they use JavaScript to remove the comments and eval the resulting string. So I wouldn't recommend that unless you really, really are into this sort of thing, but it's kind of interesting to know about. So there you go. I wasted 2 minutes of your time telling you about it. Okay, things that didn't matter for my site. These are things that page speed told me to do, or just, everybody's doing it, I want to do it kind of thing. And they didn't matter for my site. That doesn't mean they're not going to matter for your site. In some cases, I don't even know why they didn't matter for my site, and that's okay or it's not okay. But I'm not saying these aren't things worth doing. I'm saying that these were things that didn't matter for me, and you might want to try them and see if they matter for you. One is everything. All these performance tools tell you to turn on HTTP keep alives. So I did. And maybe the situations I was measuring didn't trigger the issues or something. I don't know, but it didn't hurt my performance. It helped it, but not outside of the error bars. Like it was, a few tens of milliseconds or something. I mean, and that really shocked me. I really thought for sure, especially because of the way my site is set up. It seems like it really should be affected by this, but for some reason it wasn't. It's a mystery. The world may never know. It takes 3 licks to get to the center of a Tootsie Roll Tootsie Pop. Yeah. Another thing that didn't really do anything for, well, that actually hurt my performance slightly, and this totally shocked me, was spriting my background images. So they're not background images anymore, and that may have actually been the issue, maybe, now that I think about it. Wow, epiphany. Is that as a background image, maybe the whole thing about that I mentioned before about the CSS parsing was actually what the problem was, and not the loading of the, oh yeah, I'll have to look into that. Anyway, for whatever reason, I sprited the images. By the way, I still have Keep Alives turned on because it didn't hurt performance, so why the heck not? But, Anyway, spriting images. So, I set up Compass. I had it automated. It was going to be awesome. And, it didn't really, it actually slightly hurt performance. So, all right, well, screw this. I'm not going to do this. So I got rid of it, especially because, now the reason why I got rid of that for the most part is really that keeping, when you change the images, having to resprite them and everything, even with Compass helping out, it was just a pain. It wasn't a huge pain. It was just enough hassle for me to look for an excuse not to do it, and this was my excuse. I might look into this again, in another 6 months or a year or something, or next time we do a redesign. But for now, I'm not spriting images. And again, I'm not saying you shouldn't sprite your images. A lot of people with much bigger brains than me insist that it really helps on their sites. So, but just make sure you measure. Make sure you use webpagetest.org or your own testing setup or whatever, or real user measurements if you can get them. To determine whether or not stuff's helping. Okay, we're going to move on. So that was all about performance, but awesomeness, native app awesomeness, and awesomeness in general is not just about performance. So one thing that I did for my site is I wanted it to work offline. I want when you boot up, when you click on an app, a native app, it comes up, the interface is there. Sometimes you can't get content if you're offline, but the app comes up, and certainly static and cached content you can get to. So I wanted that for my site. Well, HTML5 offers the offline Appcache. I want to say API. It's not. I mean, there is an API, but I'm not really using the API part. I'm just using the sort of you get it for free Appcache part. And it's supported on iOS, it's supported on Android, and that's more than 99% of my mobile traffic, so I'm happy. I believe it's also supported on modern BlackBerries, pretty much anything that's WebKit. Anyway, the other thing is that it kind of is about performance, though, because, it's kind of the cache on steroids. So you can use the offline app cache to tell your device to cache a bunch of things that the user hasn't even loaded, and it will cache them permanently until you tell it, okay, you don't need to cache this anymore. And so, for example, if you go to mucsf.edu and click around a little bit, do a few things, and then you turn your phone onto airplane mode. And then you click the emergency, you go to the home screen loads up, and you click the emergency icon, which hopefully you haven't clicked before. That page will still load up. We decided that no matter what, whether the user is offline or online, we want them to be able to get to the police phone number and things like that. So that's kind of cool, and it enhances performance, so that's exciting, but it's also about offline availability, so I kind of have these slides backwards, I guess, because I already talked about that. Moving on. So there is a warning I have about the offline app cache. So if you're using responsive images, the offline app cache hates you. And in fact, there's an article by Jake Archibald, who is a great coder at Lanyard, who basically said, I think he said that it hates you and your family or something like that. But the title of the article is one that I wish I had come up with, but I'm kind of glad I didn't, because had I come up with it, I wouldn't be able to write the article. But now that I'm just quoting somebody else, I get to actually say it in a professional environment. Title of the article, and it's a really good article, is Application Cache is a Douchebag. And this is part of why. because so really quickly, responsive images, and I believe Eric showed an example of this in his last talk. Responsive images, one typical way of doing responsive images is to have, for example, the proposed picture element, or you replicate it with a div or whatever, but you have, a bunch of images that that the browser chooses which one to download based on media queries. There's no media queries in the application cache manifest. You have to tell it what files to download. So if you want that to work, you have to tell the browser to download all of the images, which kind of defeats the purpose of responsive images on something like a mobile device. So I tried to fix this problem with a project. It's called PickyFill, which if you go to trot.github.com, there's a link there. And so PickyFill takes Scott Gell's PictureFill polyfill, which is a pretty popular responsive images implementation. And what it does is, if you are using an offline Appcache manifest, it tries to take those the images that you end up downloading based on the media queries, and it converts them to data URLs and stores them in local storage. So this just seemed really, really fun and really exciting, and it was awesome. Of course, I was very, very disappointed to find out that Android 2.3, it's dependent on a campus function called toDataURL, I think. Android 2.3 implements it by always returning what amounts to essentially an empty string. So this doesn't really, so in Android 2.3, it doesn't work. So the solution there that I recommend in the README is to make sure that your offline manifest has what's called a fallback image, so that, basically if you're offline and you don't have anything in local storage, you get this stupid image that, is the same, that isn't the real image, but it's sort of an indicator that there will be an image there if you ever get back online. Anyway, that was fun and exciting, and I wanted to tell a lot of people about it, so that's why I'm telling you about it. There you go. It mostly worked. So because it only mostly worked, I'm not using it on the UCSF mobile site. I chose to just stick with Appcache and not do responsive images. So that means that whether you're on an iPad or an iPhone, you're downloading a 72 by 72 image, and it's being resized on the iPhone. I don't feel great about that, but again, performance measurements indicate performance is actually A-okay with that. If I have to use it to make a desktop site, I'm not so sure that's going to work as well. But if you're just making a site that's for tablets and phones, it's pretty easy to get away with. Okay. Yes, local storage, I just mentioned it. It's another HTML5 thing, and it rocks. And so I use local storage to make dynamic content available offline. So for example, you go to MUCSF.edu, you click on news, and you get a bunch of headlines. And then you come back tomorrow, but you're offline, and you click news, it tries to go get the news, it fails, so it goes to local storage and pulls out the news and displays that for you instead. So you get yesterday's headlines, and then if you try to get more details, you're told that you're offline, please go online. And the alternative would be to, tell someone they need to get online right away. I don't know, for the news might be a bad example, but the events calendar is also an RSS feed, very similar, same thing, and I think that, it's probably useful to get, if you can't get the calendar events from if you can't get the calendar events for right now, but you looked at it 3 hours ago and you're trying to remind yourself what room something was in, why not just have that information cached and provide the user a superior experience? It also means that if it's taking forever to load the RSS feed because it's on some other server and that other server is performing badly, that the user gets immediate info, like it takes about a second and it says, all right, I give up, and it gives us the cached information. And I also use it to store, the last trip you did in the shuttle trip planner, so that, I never ride the yellow shuttle, but I always ride the lime shuttle. Why can't it remember that about me? And you may be tempted to use a cookie for that. Cookies, they get sent on every request, and bad things can happen, especially, the trip planner maybe not such a terrible idea. But certainly with things like, do you really want to be sending every request for images and everything else? You really want to be sending over the entire cached feed from the calendar. Okay, I'm going to move on. Okay, so lightning touch. So one of the things that makes mobile websites feel sluggish and kind of garbagey is that you go to click on a link and there's a 200 to 400 millisecond delay while the browser waits to make sure you're not double clicking or clicking and dragging or pinching and zooming or whatever it is you might actually be doing. If all you want is when the user touches the link, you as quickly as possible swap in the new content, then that's what this does. So it's a JavaScript utility, but you don't need to know any JavaScript to use it. You just need to follow the markup directions. And the way it works is instead of listening for on-click event, which is what would normally happen, it listens for touch events. And that creates all sorts of problems if you try to do it just yourself, just try to do it naively. It takes care of all those problems. And then swaps, and then if you have the information already loaded in some other div that's hidden, it just swaps it right in. So you can go to the demo and don't go to it on a laptop because it's kind of pointless. But if you go to it on a touch device and at the bottom try click 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 click, it doesn't work. And then if you put it on top, click 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 click, it works. Bottom, click once and wait 200 milliseconds, it'll work. So, okay. Some other things to know: your site is probably ugly as sin, and it's absolutely worth spending a little bit of money to get someone, preferably a web designer who has front-end knowledge about performance. And it sounds like it's a hard bill to fill. It's not. Well, it's not that it's not a hard bill to fill, but the real problem isn't that that's a hard bill to fill. The real problem is that it's terribly easy to get people who don't know that stuff. It's just much, but you really want to get someone who knows what they're doing with performance and is not going to hand you a Photoshop image and say this is what your site should look like. So again, though, if your site just needs to do what the West Virginia University Library site does and just be a list of links, you don't need this. But again, if you're here and if you've listened to me ramble for the last 32 minutes, chances are that's not what you're looking for. Okay, so here's my challenge to you folks, which is that a typical EDU mobile site loads in 2.5 seconds, so do better than that. And in fact, that's not really my challenge. My challenge is that the fast mobile EDU site loads in about 1 3/4 seconds, so do better than that. The last slide I have is some resources. I mentioned webpagetest.org, so I won't mention that again. I think I mentioned PageSpeed, but if not, it's pretty self-explanatory. Go there, go there, go there. I didn't mention the Google Analytics site speed sample rate. So, in your Google Analytics, you may or may not have noticed under content there's something called site speed. Anybody notice that? Notice that? So, it's really awesome because it gives you real user measurements of your site. So you can use something like WebPageTest or your own test devices or whatever to try to get data about how fast your site loads. But nothing is going to beat actual data about what actual users are experiencing. So it's pretty fantastic. There are some really unfortunate limitations, or at least I should say there is one really unfortunate limitation, and that's that the Google Analytics site speed implementation is dependent upon performance.timing in JavaScript being implemented in the browser. That is implemented in most browsers. The big exception is Safari, which means all your iOS users do not send site speed data. And in my case, that's like 77% of my users. So, but it's really good for finding out how Android users are doing. Now, one of the things is that the amount of traffic that sites like mine get, and I'm going to guess the typical person in this room's site, it doesn't really get enough traffic
for the default sampling rate, because they don't get the performance timing stuff from every visitor. So you end up with it's 1%, I think, of visitors, and then of course there's all the Safari people where it doesn't work at all. And so you end up with 1 or 2 visitors a day sending data, and that's really way too small a sample set to really draw anything meaningful, any meaningful conclusions from that. So what you can do is follow that link, and it sends you to the part in the Google Analytics documentation where it tells you how to bump that up to 100%. And you can max out to 10,000 readings a day. So if you get 10,000 visitors a day to your mobile site, maybe you don't want to do that. But if you get 20,000 visitors a day, maybe you want it at 50% or something like that. And then there's the lightning touch. I already talked about that. One thing I did mean to comment on really quickly. Is that a question or no? Okay. One thing I did mean to comment on is responsive design, because that's what we're talking about a lot today. And so that 37-second site, it's a responsive design site. This is not to say that responsive design is bad, or that performance of responsive design sites is bad, but it is to say that my anecdotal observations would be that it is very easy to make a responsive design site that ends up forcing the mobile phone to download half a megabyte of content, or a megabyte of content, or 2 megabytes of content, or in one case I saw 3.7 megabytes of content. And so it's really important to be careful to focus on that, and I'm happy to say that as far as I can tell, the approach that WebBlocks is taking for MWF 2.0, whatever it will end up being called, does seem to take all of that into consideration. That's very heartening. But if you're pursuing responsive right now, again, I can't stress enough, you need to actually measure your performance and not do the cargo cult thing where it's like, well, I sprited my images, so I'm sure it's going to perform awesome, because that's not the way it works. Okay, I think I have, 10 minutes? 8 minutes? Something like that. So, all right, thanks. Any questions, or anyone want to rip me a new arm? Yes, gentleman in the front row. So, for the benefit of the people in internet land, the question was, could it be that my lack of a performance increase when I sprited my icons, could it be caused by the fact that I am also using an offline Appcache? And the answer to that question is,
Just another thing to think about, maybe.
I'll think about it on the plane ride home. Okay, so does image optimization interfere with duplicate functionality from mod deflate? No, it does not interfere. First of all, when I turned on mod deflate, I didn't turn it on for images. I only turned it on for text assets, because images are already compressed through various algorithms as much as they can be compressed typically. So I guess the question is sort of, yeah, maybe sort of. I wouldn't recommend turning on mod deflate for images anyway. So whether or not it, I guess you probably, my guess, although again, let's not do this faith-based, let's do it and measure it sometime, or maybe not, but my guess is that, yeah, trying to compress something that's already compressed is going to hurt and not help. So yes, that is a good point. Do not use mod deflate blanket on everything. Use mod deflate on stuff that makes sense to compress, which would be HTML, CSS, JavaScript, text assets. Don't use it for multimedia assets. Don't use it for images. Those things should already be compressed as much as possible, or nearly as much as possible. Yes, Ian. Sure. So image optimization typically involves things like simplifying the palette or optimizing the palette so that
you may have more colors than can actually be displayed in the pixels for the image you actually have, things like that. And so image optimization is all about that. It's not about applying some sort of compression codec to the image. Does that? Thank you. Okay. Yes. Really. Okay, so I was just accused of not recommending Photoshop for image optimization. No. So the point where I mentioned Photoshop was when a designer gives you a website design that's like one Photoshop file. That's here's what your website should look like, and is not, and the designer doesn't, the web designer does not understand markup and that sort of stuff, because you need to have these conversations with people. Now, what you're talking, it sounds to me like what you're talking about. You said display arts. You're talking about like things that end up getting printed.
No, I was just talking about colors.
Okay, so I'm not going to repeat that question, but I think it's, well, I'm not going to repeat that comment because I don't want to mangle it. But I will say that a knowledgeable person using Photoshop should be able to produce perfectly fine optimized images, but idiots like me like to take entire directories and run them through something like ImageOptim and then just do a side-by-side comparison and make sure, because I have no idea what I'm doing when I optimize an image, but I do know that I get things from the designers that are crazy huge because, you know, I don't know why. They're probably not thinking about the mobile web, and that's okay, I guess. But certainly it never hurts, should never hurt, I should say, to just, you know, run it, you know, run a second check. But yes, I would agree that someone who knows what they're doing can use image editing tools to do the image optimization, for sure.
So just one other designer question, because
I don't have one. I don't care about the page size. I care about the actual experience. So if a page is you know 500 kilobytes, but it provides a really great experience for the user and it loads quickly, then I don't care. A lot of the if you look at the waterfall chart for example my site, a lot of the things end up loading after onload. So a lot of the resources like the calendar and newsfeed type stuff doesn't even get loaded until after everything that the user actually sees on first page, you know, when they come to the home screen, is already loaded. So you know, there's various methods and techniques you can use to get around limits, and you know there probably is a reasonable limit somewhere, but I just would rather worry about what the actual experience of the user is. Chris, you've been so patient. What is it?
Are you display that on another dashboard?
Okay, so the amazing, awesome Chris Weber is asking, am I using something other than Google Analytics? Am I, for example, working with the Apache logs or maybe collecting data through some other mechanism to get more detailed information? Because there are certainly a lot of limitations in Google Analytics. And a lot of the limitations in Google Analytics, by the way, are intentional because they don't want people to use Google Analytics to get privacy, you know, to basically figure out privacy stuff, who's looking at X, Y, and Z when sort of things. Anyway, at least it's my impression. But back to the question. Occasionally I grep through the logs, so I don't have to talk to the people who run it. Well, I kind of do have to talk to the people who run the server, but you know, I have access to the logs, and sometimes I grep through them. I'm not using, you know, pwik or whatever, and I'm not like, you know, using local log analyzers or crunch. I'm not doing a whole lot of stuff. Occasionally I'll insert something into the code to sort of ping a URL where I'm collecting data about, you know, I want to know, you know, how often do people get there this way rather than that way or something, and it's just easier to just do it that way. So what I try to avoid doing, certainly there's a lot more information you can get if you're looking at your local logs. The barrier to entry is higher, of course, but there's a lot of information you can get from that, and it's really good information. But one thing I try to avoid doing is just collecting information because I can. And so when I do something like that, I always want to know exactly what the question is that I'm trying to answer. So, you know, sometimes someone might come and say, "Hey, can you tell me how many page views we had last month?" And I try to resist actually telling them. I instead go back and say, "What is it you're trying to figure out?"
Because half the time they don't know what they're trying to figure out, and you give them the information, and they're like, well, how about unique visitors? Well, how about this? How about that? And it's a fishing expedition. And I do that myself all the time. Like I log into Google Analytics and I spend like 10 minutes poking around trying to find something useful. And you know what? If I don't know what I'm looking for, I shouldn't be here. And that's just like a time management skill. So I've sort of totally interpreted the question as I wanted it to, the question I wanted you to ask, not the question you actually asked. But I hope that's okay. Well, I'm out of time. All right, thanks everybody.